The summer of 1940 was a dark period for Europe as Nazi forces, led by Adolf Hitler, swept across the continent, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. The Third Reich had already solidified its grip on Germany, and its reach was rapidly expanding, with the brutality of the regime growing ever more evident. Yet amid this rising tide of terror, there were those who dared to resist, those who understood the stakes of the conflict on a deeply personal level. One such man was Witold Pilecki, a Polish cavalry officer, whose name would become forever linked to the horrors of Auschwitz and the silent, yet vital, resistance movement that formed within its walls. Auschwitz, though little more than a remote village at the time, would become the site of one of history's most terrifying and systematic efforts to annihilate an entire people. In 1940, the Nazis had begun to use it as a concentration camp, and its initial function was far more a place of imprisonment than of extermination. However, its potential for cruelty was quickly realized by the SS, and the first transports of Jews began to arrive, setting the stage for what would become one of the most notorious death camps in the history of World War II. It was into this environment that Witold Pilecki entered voluntarily as a secret agent. His mission was audacious, so much so that it seemed almost unbelievable. Pilecki, a man who had been a soldier in the Polish army, was not captured by the Nazis. He did not stumble into Auschwitz by accident. He infiltrated it willingly to gather intelligence, organize resistance, and provide the Allies with crucial information about the Nazis' atrocities. Pilecki's story begins in the midst of an already devastated Poland. The Polish army had been overwhelmed by the German invasion of September 1939, and the country had quickly been divided between Nazi and Soviet occupation. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Polish resistance was already in its infancy, and Pilecki, a man driven by an unyielding sense of duty, immediately joined these underground efforts. He recognized that the Nazis' systematic oppression was more than just a military conquest. It was a program of annihilation aimed at entire groups of people, and he understood the moral imperative to stop it. His courage, however, would not simply be a matter of fighting back against an invading force. It would involve exposing the very heart of Nazi terror, entering the dark world of Auschwitz itself. To infiltrate the camp, Pilecki had to first put himself in harm's way in a way that no one else could have possibly imagined. He allowed himself to be captured by the Germans during a raid on his home in Warsaw. In the fall of 1940, Pilecki was arrested, detained, and sent to Auschwitz, along with a group of other Polish civilians. His plan was simple, but daring: survive the brutality of the camp, gain the trust of other prisoners, and ultimately organize a resistance that would help gather intelligence about the Nazis' operations and atrocities. From within, he would document the horrific conditions and perhaps even aid in the escape of prisoners or sabotage the Nazis' war efforts. The goal was not just to survive, but to resist, to be the eyes and ears of the outside world within the very heart of darkness. The conditions within Auschwitz were appalling from the moment Pilecki arrived. The camp was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and ruled with unrelenting violence by the SS guards. Prisoners were forced into grueling labor, subjected to medical experiments, and faced brutal punishment for even the slightest infraction. The sense of hopelessness was palpable, yet Pilecki, despite his own suffering, retained his focus on the larger mission. He quickly began to organize a network of fellow prisoners who would work with him to carry out acts of resistance. This would become the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZWZ, the military organization that operated covertly within the camp. In the early days, Pilecki's operations were small. He would gather scraps of information, talk to fellow prisoners, and smuggle messages out of the camp whenever possible. The Nazis had yet to fully realize the scale of their own atrocities, but the prisoners in Auschwitz were beginning to grasp the true nature of what was happening to them. There were whispers of the gas chambers, the mass executions, and the horrific experiments conducted on men, women, and children. Pilecki, despite his position in this hellish environment, remained resolute. He understood that the success of the resistance would depend not just on survival, but on the careful gathering of intelligence that could eventually be used to stop the Nazis. While Pilecki was surviving in Auschwitz, Europe was changing rapidly. The German war machine was advancing on all fronts. The Allies, particularly the British and the French, were reeling from defeat after defeat. Yet, despite the growing darkness that spread across the continent, there were glimmers of hope. The first signs of organized resistance were beginning to emerge in places like France, Belgium, and even within Germany itself. But in Poland, the situation was different. The Polish resistance was one of the most active in all of Europe, and it was against this backdrop that Pilecki's efforts would truly begin to shine. His detailed reports, which he managed to smuggle out of Auschwitz with the help of trusted contacts, provided the Allies with vital intelligence on the Nazis' plans for further extermination and the development of their final solution. These reports would become crucial to the war effort, and, in hindsight, they would demonstrate the enormous significance of Pilecki's actions. Yet, despite the importance of his mission, Pilecki's efforts remained largely unknown to the outside world. Auschwitz was still relatively obscure on the global stage in 1940, and the scale of a Nazi genocide had not yet fully been realized. His intelligence reports painted a picture of unimaginable suffering, but it would take time for the full extent of the Nazi death machine to be acknowledged. Pilecki's letters, smuggled out of Auschwitz, were the first warning signals to the Allies about the scope of the horror that awaited the Jewish people and others targeted by the Nazis. In those early days, Pilecki had no idea just how long his mission would last. He had entered Auschwitz with the belief that he would be able to gather intelligence and then escape. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the reality of the camp's brutality began to sink in. The sheer scale of the Nazi operation was far greater than he had imagined. It was a system built on terror, and Pilecki was at that point just another prisoner within it. But in those first few months, a certain resilience began to form within Pilecki. His sense of duty to his comrades, his sense of moral obligation, and his unyielding resolve to resist the Nazis drove him to act in ways that few others could have. He would come to symbolize the spirit of resistance, a man who chose not just to fight, but to stand against the overwhelming evil of the Nazi regime from within its own walls. And while the world outside would remain largely unaware of his efforts, Witold Pilecki was about to embark on one of the most extraordinary and courageous operations in the history of World War II. The days that followed Witold Pilecki's arrival at Auschwitz were not just filled with the unimaginable horrors of the camp, but also marked the beginning of a profoundly dangerous mission. For Pilecki, Auschwitz was not just a place of imprisonment and suffering. It was a ground zero for resistance, a place where the possibility of survival was slim, yet where the chance to strike back at the Nazi war machine remained. As the weeks stretched into months, Pilecki had to not only adjust to the camp's horrific conditions, but also to organize the resistance network that would one day come to be known as the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZWZ. This was not a simple matter of survival. It was an act of defiance in the heart of one of the most brutal places on earth. Upon his arrival, Pilecki faced a difficult choice. The camp was notorious for its mercilessness. Its reputation spread like wildfire among those who had heard rumors of its nature. Prisoners were not only subjected to physical violence, but also to psychological warfare. The camp was a microcosm of Nazi terror, where death, cruelty, and despair pervaded every part of life. Yet Pilecki's eyes were not merely fixed on his own suffering. His mind was set on the larger picture, the intelligence that could be gathered, the resistance that could be built, and ultimately the possibility of sabotaging the Nazis' horrific plans. The first months in Auschwitz were spent in a constant battle to survive while keeping his mission alive. The Nazis were ruthless in their approach to maintaining control. Prisoners were subjected to grueling work, severe beatings, starvation, and the constant threat of death. Anyone who was deemed a threat was swiftly dealt with, often in the form of brutal executions or being sent to the gas chambers. Yet, Pilecki quickly realized that survival was not enough. To succeed in his mission, he needed to understand the internal workings of Auschwitz, the dynamics between the prisoners, and the weaknesses in the Nazi operations that could be exploited. Auschwitz, at that time, was primarily a concentration camp, and the atrocities being committed that were still hidden from the outside world. The gas chambers, while in place, were not yet in full operation for mass exterminations, and the scale of the genocide had not yet reached the horrifying proportions that would characterize it in later years. But that would soon change. The growing number of Jewish prisoners, along with Roma and Polish civilians, gave rise to an increasingly desperate situation. Pilecki, already deeply embedded in the camp's prison population, soon realized that he had a responsibility not just to gather intelligence, but to act as a guiding force for others who were suffering alongside him. In the beginning, his resistance activities were small in scale, consisting of subtle actions that would not raise suspicion. He built trust among his fellow prisoners, seeking out those who might have similar inclinations for resistance. Some were Jews who had been imprisoned for their ethnicity, others were political prisoners, and still others were civilians like Pilecki, arrested for various offenses by the Nazi regime. Through whispered conversations and secret meetings, Pilecki began to form the nucleus of what would become a highly organized resistance within the camp. It was a delicate operation. Any misstep could mean immediate death for himself and for everyone involved. The ZWZ operated in the shadows, using the most basic forms of communication to exchange information. The constant surveillance and brutality of the SS guards made it difficult to act openly. So Pilecki and his network developed covert methods for smuggling messages out of the camp. They would use scraps of paper hidden within the lining of their clothes, or pass notes through trusted intermediaries who could move around the camp without attracting attention. Every action was fraught with risk, but Pilecki's resolve was unshakable. He knew that the information he gathered could save thousands, and this belief kept him going even in the darkest moments. The reports Pilecki managed to send out were nothing short of extraordinary. In them, he detailed the growing scale of the Nazis' operations within the camp. While much of the world was still unaware of the full extent of the horrors being perpetrated by the Third Reich, Pilecki was already bearing witness to the monstrous machinery of death that was being put in place. He learned about the gas chambers and the crematoria, about the experiments being conducted on prisoners, about the rampant abuse that was commonplace among the SS. His reports provided a crucial glimpse into the brutality that was unfolding, and though they went largely ignored by the Allies at first, they laid the groundwork for what would later become a global awareness of the Holocaust. But the nature of Pilecki's mission meant that he could never rest. His was a job that demanded constant vigilance and an unyielding will to fight. It was not enough to simply report on the atrocities being committed. Pilecki's work also entailed sabotaging the Nazis' plans. He coordinated small acts of defiance, aimed at undermining the functioning of the camp and interfering with its operations. These acts range from smuggling food and supplies to prisoners, organizing escapes, and even seeking out information about potential weaknesses in the camp's infrastructure that could be exploited for sabotage. Every move had to be calculated, every decision weighed against the threat it posed to the larger mission. Pilecki's resistance network was not just a group of individuals hoping to escape the horrors of Auschwitz. It was an underground army with a singular goal: to expose the truth, to resist in any way possible, and to fight back against the most monstrous system ever devised by human hands. But even as he organized the resistance within the camp, Pilecki knew that he could not do this alone. He needed support from the outside world, from the Polish underground resistance that he had once been a part of. His reports were sent through a network of trusted individuals, some of whom were part of the underground Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa. Pilecki's hope was that this larger resistance movement would eventually act upon the intelligence he was providing, pushing for action to stop the Nazi genocide from escalating further. For all the courage Pilecki displayed in those early months, the psychological toll was immense. Every day he spent in Auschwitz felt like a day that could be his last. Yet he held on to the belief that his mission was critical, that even if his own survival was uncertain, his efforts would have far-reaching consequences. He took solace in the camaraderie of the other prisoners, who, despite their suffering, maintained a sense of hope that they were not forgotten. Their silent acts of defiance, their quiet resistance, were fuel for Pilecki's determination. Over time, the resistance network in Auschwitz began to grow. What started as a few scattered individuals with a shared desire to fight back against the Nazis slowly became a formidable force. The ZWZ began to organize larger and more coordinated actions, with the ultimate goal of creating a full-scale uprising. Pilecki's vision of a collective effort to escape the Nazis' control was taking shape, and as the resistance network expanded, so did the risks. The SS guards began to notice subtle disruptions in the camp's operations. Prisoners were speaking out more openly, though still quietly, and acts of sabotage were becoming more frequent. Despite the ever-present danger, Pilecki's spirit never wavered. He remained a symbol of hope in an otherwise hopeless place, and the actions of the ZWZ showed that even in the heart of darkness, there was resistance, there was defiance. This resistance, while small and largely unnoticed at first, would eventually grow into something much larger, a beacon of courage that would reverberate through the walls of Auschwitz and beyond, as the world would one day learn the truth about the camp's atrocities and the bravery of those who dared to fight back. Pilecki's legacy was not just one of survival. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most desperate of circumstances. The early chapters of his resistance, though fraught with unimaginable danger, would serve as the foundation for everything that followed. They were the first steps in a long and treacherous journey, one that would cost Pilecki dearly, yet would prove to be a pivotal part of the larger fight against the Nazi regime. As the months stretched into the bitter winter of 1941, Witold Pilecki's mission inside Auschwitz grew more complex, dangerous, and relentless. The initial phase of his operation had been focused on survival and gathering intelligence, but with each passing day, the scope of his mission deepened. The camp was rapidly becoming the epicenter of Nazi atrocities, and Pilecki, embedded within it, was increasingly aware of the full scale of the horrors that the Nazis were carrying out. But the more he learned, the more determined he became. His resistance network, the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZWZ, was growing, but so too was the threat that the Nazis posed to the prisoners of Auschwitz. As the brutality of the camp increased, so did the necessity of Pilecki's work, and the urgency of his mission became more clear than ever. The rise of Auschwitz as a central hub for Nazi genocide was not instantaneous. Initially, the camp had been set up to house Polish political prisoners, but it quickly evolved into a site of mass imprisonment for various groups, including Jews, Roma, and other targeted minorities. In the early years of the war, the primary purpose of the camp had been to break the spirit of these prisoners through hard labor, violence, and starvation. Yet as the war progressed, it became evident that Auschwitz was becoming a key part of the Nazis' final solution. The first mass executions, carried out with the use of gas chambers, began in 1941, and Pilecki, through his network, was one of the first to report these horrors to the outside world. For Pilecki, this shift from concentration to extermination camp marked a turning point. The realization that Auschwitz was not merely a place of incarceration, but a death machine had an enormous impact on him. The prisoners were no longer just victims of forced labor. They were being systematically murdered. His reports began to take on an increasingly urgent tone as he detailed the growing scale of the genocide. He wrote about the transports of Jews that arrived at the camp, about the inhumane selection process that determined who would live and who would die, and about the gas chambers where hundreds of people were sent to their deaths. Each new detail he uncovered reinforced the critical nature of his mission. The world needed to know what was happening inside Auschwitz, and it was up to him to ensure that the truth reached the Allies, even if it cost him his life. But gathering and smuggling this information out of Auschwitz was not without its challenges. The Nazis, as always, were vigilant in maintaining their control over the camp, and the risk of being caught was ever present. The SS guards had become more sophisticated in their methods of surveillance, and their brutality was unmatched. Prisoners were routinely subjected to beatings, torture, and execution for the slightest offenses. The idea of organizing a resistance within such a system seemed impossible to many, but Pilecki's perseverance made it happen. He continued to use his network, smuggling out reports, and even organizing escape attempts when possible. The resistance operated in secrecy, relying on subtlety and cunning to avoid detection by the SS. In those early months, Pilecki's reports to the outside world were an essential lifeline. Through a network of trusted contacts, he managed to pass along the intelligence he had gathered. These reports, though crude by modern standards, were vital in alerting the Allies to the horrors of Auschwitz and the scope of the Nazi death camps. However, the world was slow to respond. The information that Pilecki and his fellow resistance fighters were sending was difficult for many to believe. In the midst of a world at war, the idea of systematic genocide was still beyond the grasp of most people. The reports were often dismissed or ignored, and the Nazi regime continued its program of mass murder unabated. As the war raged on, the conditions inside Auschwitz grew worse. The camp's population continued to swell as more prisoners were brought in from across Europe. The Nazis were tightening their grip on every aspect of camp life, making it more difficult for Pilecki's resistance to function effectively. The brutality of the SS guards increased in direct proportion to the number of prisoners who were arriving. Those who survived the selection process were forced into grueling labor, and any sign of rebellion or resistance was crushed ruthlessly. It was during this time that Pilecki began to realize the true nature of the Nazi regime's control. The brutality of Auschwitz was not simply about physical violence. It was also about breaking the will of the people. The SS used fear and terror as tools of governance, and the camp's purpose was not only to kill but to degrade, humiliate, and break the spirits of the people who were imprisoned there. For many, survival became a daily struggle, not only against the physical deprivation, but also against the psychological toll of being trapped in a place where death was a constant presence. Pilecki was not just fighting for survival. He was fighting for dignity, for the possibility of resistance, and for the hope that one day the world would know the truth of what had happened. The growing scale of the Nazi genocide meant that the resistance network needed to adapt and expand. Pilecki understood that any chance of bringing about meaningful change would require greater coordination and more effective action. His small resistance group inside the camp began to grow in strength, reaching out to other prisoners and building a more solid foundation. The ZWZ grew not just in numbers, but also in its capacity to act. Prisoners were secretly stockpiling weapons, communicating with outside forces, and planning for the day when they would have the opportunity to strike back. Yet the risks of doing so were immense. Any move to openly challenge the Nazis would result in the swift execution of hundreds of innocent lives. While Pilecki's primary objective remained the gathering of intelligence and the sabotage of the Nazi war effort, he was also increasingly concerned with the possibility of an uprising within the camp. By the end of 1941, the first significant acts of resistance had taken place in Auschwitz, but they were small and isolated. Pilecki knew that if they were to have any hope of overcoming the Nazis, they would need to wait for the right moment, when the resistance was strong enough and when the outside world might finally take notice of what was happening inside the camp. This was the delicate balance that Pilecki had to navigate, working in secrecy, building the network, while at the same time preparing for the eventual moment when the world would be forced to confront the truth about Auschwitz. The weight of this responsibility was immense. Pilecki knew that every decision he made could cost lives, including his own. Yet he also understood that his actions were crucial to the future of Europe. The fate of millions of people depended on the success of his mission, and he would stop at nothing to ensure that his work would have meaning. His belief in the righteousness of his cause sustained him through the darkest of times. Even when it seemed that the Nazis would never be defeated, Pilecki's faith in the possibility of a better future remained unshaken. He drew strength not only from his resolve, but from the knowledge that he was not alone. His comrades in the resistance, though scattered and operating in secrecy, were fighting alongside him, each one committed to the same goal: to resist, to survive, and to expose the horrors of Auschwitz to the world. As 1941 came to a close, Pilecki's resolve was harder than ever. The information he had gathered, the resistance he had helped build, and the sacrifices of those around him were all part of a larger effort to bring an end to the Nazi regime. The world may not have yet understood the scale of what was happening in Auschwitz, but Pilecki knew that the day would come when the truth would be revealed. Until then, he would continue to fight in the shadows, gathering intelligence, resisting the Nazis, and providing hope to those around him. The road ahead was uncertain, but Pilecki's belief in the necessity of his mission never wavered. In the darkest of times, he remained steadfast in his determination to make a difference, no matter the cost. As 1942 unfolded, Auschwitz continued to transform into one of the most infamous sites of Nazi cruelty. For Witold Pilecki, the brutality of the camp had already become a horrifying reality. What had started as a mission to infiltrate and gather intelligence had, by now, become a life-or-death struggle, not only for his survival, but for the survival of his resistance network, and ultimately for the lives of the millions who would eventually be caught in the grip of the Nazi death machine. The weight of the mission was growing heavier with each passing day, and every action Pilecki took carried immense risk. But in this dark and desperate environment, his resolve only strengthened, and his commitment to the task at hand became more urgent. By early 1942, the scale of Nazi atrocities at Auschwitz had reached staggering proportions. The extermination process had become more systematic. The infamous gas chambers, which had been introduced in late 1941, were now fully operational, and their deadly efficiency was unparalleled. Jews, Roma, and other victims arrived daily in ever-increasing numbers, each group subjected to the harrowing selection process upon arrival, where those deemed unfit for labor were sent straight to their deaths. The screams of the victims, the plumes of smoke from the crematoria, and the constant presence of death cast a shadow over everything. The world beyond the camp still remained largely unaware of the true scale of the genocide, and within Auschwitz itself, Pilecki's work as a spy and resistance organizer took on an even greater sense of urgency. Pilecki's primary objective remained to gather intelligence on the Nazis' plans and to disrupt their operations from within. But as the atrocities became more extreme, the moral weight of his mission grew more profound. He was not merely fighting against a military occupation. He was engaged in a battle against one of history's most efficient systems of mass murder. With each report he smuggled out of the camp, Pilecki provided the Allies with crucial information about the Nazis' plans for genocide. But despite the mounting evidence of mass killings, the world outside seemed slow to respond. It wasn't just the scale of the murders that was difficult to grasp. It was the industrialized nature of the killing. The gas chambers, the crematoria, and the systematic selection process were part of a deliberate strategy to eliminate entire populations. Pilecki knew that exposing these facts to the outside world was his only hope of halting the madness. However, smuggling information out of Auschwitz was becoming increasingly difficult. The camp had become a tightly controlled fortress, and the SS had instituted more stringent security measures. The growing awareness of the underground resistance meant that the Nazis were becoming more vigilant, increasing their efforts to root out those who opposed them. Pilecki's resistance network had to become more creative and resourceful in how it operated. They used secret compartments in their barracks, devised new ways of communicating with the outside world, and even made use of trusted fellow prisoners who worked in areas where they could pass along messages. These efforts were incredibly risky, but the information they provided to the outside world would become instrumental in exposing the truth about Auschwitz. But while the intelligence-gathering effort remained crucial, Pilecki understood that the time for passive resistance was quickly running out. The scale of the genocide could no longer be ignored. If the world was to stop the Nazis, something far more direct was needed. The underground resistance began to shift its focus from purely informational efforts to acts of sabotage and more direct opposition to the Nazis. The ZWZ inside Auschwitz began to expand its scope, drawing in more prisoners, and even smuggling in weapons to be used in the event of an uprising. The plan was to prepare for the day when the Nazis would overreach, when their grip on the camp would slip just enough to allow the prisoners to rise up against them. This shift in strategy, however, did not come without its challenges. The fear of punishment was ever present, and any act of rebellion was met with savage retribution. Prisoners who were caught attempting to escape, organizing resistance, or even speaking out were often executed publicly to instill terror in others. Pilecki and his comrades had to weigh every decision carefully, understanding that any misstep could mean not just their own deaths, but the deaths of hundreds or even thousands of innocent people. This constant threat of exposure, of betrayal, weighed heavily on the resistance fighters. Pilecki, despite the overwhelming pressure, never wavered. His belief in the importance of their work kept him going, even as the camp descended deeper into depravity. By the middle of 1942, Auschwitz had already become the largest death camp in the Nazi system. The numbers of those being murdered were staggering. The gas chambers were not just a tool of mass murder. They were a symbol of the industrial scale of the Holocaust. Pilecki, through his reports, tried to convey the enormity of the horror unfolding within Auschwitz. But as the scale of the genocide grew, so did the difficulty of getting that message out. There were moments when Pilecki doubted whether the Allies would ever truly understand the extent of what was happening in the camp. The silence from the outside world was deafening. There were times when the resistance seemed like a futile exercise, a whisper in the wind that would never be heard. Despite this, Pilecki refused to let despair overtake him. He continued to organize the resistance within the camp, providing moral support to the other prisoners and encouraging them to resist in whatever ways they could. Even in the darkest moments, Pilecki's leadership shone through. He maintained the belief that even small acts of resistance could chip away at the Nazis' control, even if the larger effort seemed impossible. He used his position to gather information, to smuggle messages, and to support fellow prisoners who had the courage to speak out or sabotage the Nazis' operations. The ZWZ inside Auschwitz grew stronger, and while it remained covert, it became a beacon of hope for those who were determined not to go silently into the night. As the summer of 1942 gave way to autumn, the situation at Auschwitz became more dire. The Allies were still largely unaware of the scale of the killings taking place, and the Nazis were more determined than ever to carry out their plans for extermination. The flow of prisoners to the camp continued unabated, and the process of mass murder became even more methodical. Yet within this horrific environment, Pilecki and his network fought on. They continued to gather intelligence, continued to disrupt the Nazis' operations, and continued to preserve the hope that one day their resistance would not just be a footnote in history, but a crucial part of the fight to bring down the Nazi regime. By now, Pilecki's resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. He had seen and experienced horrors that most people could not even imagine. Yet he carried on, never losing sight of his larger goal, to expose the truth and to provide hope to those around him. The resistance was not just about survival. It was about standing up to the evil that had descended upon Europe and fighting back, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Pilecki's role in this underground war was essential. He was not just a spy or a resistance fighter. He had become a symbol of defiance, a living testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable evil. In the darkest days of 1942, when the gas chambers were running at full capacity and the crematoria belched smoke day and night, Witold Pilecki did not falter. He continued his work, unwavering in his commitment to the cause. His actions would ultimately prove to be a vital part of the resistance against the Nazis, though the world would not know the full extent of his efforts for many years. In the meantime, he continued to resist from within the walls of Auschwitz, determined that the truth would one day come to light, no matter what the cost. The war would continue, and the horrors of Auschwitz would only grow worse. But Pilecki, steadfast and resolute, remained committed to the fight. He had become more than a prisoner. He had become a force for resistance, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity could stand against evil. By the autumn of 1942, Witold Pilecki had spent over 2 years inside Auschwitz, and the toll of his mission was becoming increasingly apparent. The brutal environment of the camp, combined with the relentless weight of his task, had placed immense physical and psychological strain on him. But Pilecki was not merely surviving. He was building a resistance, gathering intelligence, and making desperate attempts to sabotage the Nazi operations from within. Auschwitz, however, was no longer simply a place of suffering. It had become a vast death machine, one that was becoming more efficient by the day. For Pilecki and his comrades in the underground resistance, the reality of the situation was becoming clearer. The world had yet to truly understand what was happening in this hellish place, and time was running out to stop it. The rapid escalation of the Nazi genocide and the systematic extermination of Jews and other marginalized groups left little room for doubt that Auschwitz was a focal point in a larger Nazi plan for the final solution. The gas chambers had been operational since late 1941, and by 1942, their usage was at a frighteningly high rate. Auschwitz was now a key part of the Nazis' industrialized approach to genocide, transporting millions of victims, selecting those deemed unfit for labor, and then sending them to their deaths in the gas chambers. Each day, Pilecki saw more lives extinguished, and each day, the urgency of his mission to expose the truth and stop the Nazis grew. His reports were smuggled out of the camp, but as the atrocities mounted, Pilecki began to wonder if anyone would listen in time. For most of 1942, the outside world had remained largely indifferent or unaware of the scale of the atrocities being carried out in Auschwitz. The reports that Pilecki sent were often dismissed or ignored, as the Allies were preoccupied with the war effort on multiple fronts. The Nazis' carefully constructed network of secrecy, combined with the scale of their crimes, made it difficult for the world to accept the sheer scale of the genocide. In this context, Pilecki's intelligence gathering became increasingly critical, but also more perilous. As Auschwitz continued to grow in size and significance, so did the efforts of the SS to eliminate any signs of resistance, any attempt to expose the truth. Pilecki's underground network, known as the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZWZ, became more ambitious as the atrocities mounted. They began to form more intricate plans for sabotage, as well as a greater effort to inform the world about what was happening. Pilecki knew that the SS would eventually discover his role in organizing resistance within the camp, and that the consequences would be catastrophic for him and for those around him. The resistance, which had begun in whispers, had grown into something more formidable. Prisoners had begun to trust him, and the ZWZ began to take more overt actions. They were organizing escapes, gathering weapons, and sending out more detailed intelligence about the camp's operations. But as they became more organized, the risk of detection grew. The SS had already begun to step up their measures to identify and eliminate anyone suspected of resistance. The slightest mistake could be fatal. For Pilecki, every action, every plan had to be calculated with precision. His role as the leader of the resistance had placed him at the heart of a very dangerous game. At times, he would find himself balancing on a razor's edge, facing the very real possibility that any wrong move could bring swift and brutal retaliation from the Nazis. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds against him, Pilecki remained resolute. He knew that his mission was about more than survival. It was about ensuring that the truth of what was happening inside Auschwitz would not remain hidden from the world. He believed that exposing the atrocities would force the Allies to take action, to intervene, and to put an end to the horrific crimes the Nazis were committing. But as time went on, the possibility of that intervention seemed increasingly remote. Despite the tremendous risk, Pilecki began to push for more direct action. The ZWZ network was growing in size, and the resistance members within the camp were becoming more daring. Smuggling out information, organizing escape attempts, and disrupting Nazi operations became their primary goals. Pilecki's role as a leader was pivotal, as he continued to provide direction and inspiration to the prisoners, who were often on the brink of despair. To them, he was not just a fellow prisoner. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that resistance, even in the darkest of times, was possible. His unbreakable resolve, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, gave others the courage to act. But the SS guards, aware of the growing resistance, responded with heightened brutality. Every attempt at sabotage, every act of defiance, was met with swift and brutal retaliation. Prisoners who were caught in the act of resisting were executed without mercy. The Nazis used terror to keep the prisoners in line, but the resistance, led by Pilecki, understood that their fight was not just for survival. It was for justice. They had to resist at all costs, even if that resistance was small and seemingly insignificant. Pilecki knew that he could not lead this fight alone. The strength of the ZWZ lay in its ability to unite the prisoners in a common cause, to give them a reason to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Through his efforts, Pilecki began to create a network of resistance that extended throughout the camp. This was no longer just a matter of intelligence gathering. It was about survival, solidarity, and resistance against the oppressive power of the Nazis. As 1942 progressed, the situation in Auschwitz grew direr. The camp was bursting at the seams with new arrivals, and the Nazis were putting even more effort into their plan of mass extermination. Prisoners who had survived the harsh conditions were now being worked to the bone, and the more efficient the Nazis became at exterminating those deemed unfit for labor, the greater the toll on the camp's population. Pilecki's reports, detailing the number of people killed, the methods of execution, and the growing scale of the genocide, were becoming more urgent. His goal remained the same: to expose the truth, to rally the world to stop the Nazis, and to inspire the prisoners to continue resisting, even when all hope seemed lost. In the face of this growing terror, Pilecki's leadership and the strength of the resistance network became even more critical. As the camp continued to expand, and as the Nazis' efforts to wipe out entire populations became more methodical, the resistance knew that time was running out. The Nazis were not just waging war. They were attempting to eradicate entire peoples. The sense of urgency within the resistance grew, as they knew that the only chance to thwart the Nazis was to create enough disruption and enough awareness to alert the world to the scale of the atrocities being committed. Pilecki's mission was becoming increasingly dangerous, and every day he spent in Auschwitz felt like a day closer to being discovered. The SS were tightening their grip, and the likelihood of failure was increasing with every attempt to disrupt their operations. Yet, despite the mounting risks, Pilecki's determination did not falter. He believed that the only way to stop the Nazis was to continue exposing their crimes and to unite the prisoners in a common cause. It was this belief, this steadfast commitment to the fight for justice, that sustained him through the darkest days of Auschwitz. As 1942 came to a close, Pilecki's role in the resistance inside Auschwitz had become vital. His efforts had not only saved countless lives, but had also laid the foundation for the larger resistance against the Nazi regime. Though the world was still unaware of the full extent of the Holocaust, Pilecki and his comrades knew that their efforts were not in vain. They were part of a larger movement, a movement that sought to expose the truth, to fight back against tyranny, and to bring an end to the horrors of the Nazi regime. Pilecki's story, however, was far from over. The resistance inside Auschwitz continued to grow, and the struggle against the Nazis was far from finished. As the war raged on and the genocide unfolded, Pilecki's mission remained the same: to gather intelligence, to resist, and to ensure that the world would one day know the full extent of the atrocities that were being carried out in Auschwitz. By early 1943, the grim reality of Auschwitz had taken a more desperate turn. For Witold Pilecki and his comrades in the resistance, the initial mission of gathering intelligence and disrupting the Nazi operations had evolved into a relentless struggle for survival and a race against time. The camp, once a center for forced labor and political imprisonment, had fully transformed into a mass extermination facility. The gas chambers, the crematoria, and the systematic elimination of prisoners were no longer sporadic. They had become part of the daily operations of the camp. Auschwitz, in its horror, had become a well-oiled machine of death, and for those inside, hope was a fleeting and dangerous thing. For Pilecki, every day spent within the walls of Auschwitz was a constant battle, not just for his own life, but for the lives of countless others. His role as the leader of the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych (ZWZ), the resistance movement within the camp, was becoming increasingly vital. The network was growing in numbers and ambition. Prisoners were becoming more organized, and their resolve to resist was strengthening. But this also made the risks even greater. The Nazi SS had become more aware of the possibility of resistance within the camp, and every act of defiance, every effort to sabotage the Nazis' operations, was met with swift and brutal retaliation. The intensity of the brutality was only escalating. The arrival of large transports of Jews, Roma, and other prisoners continued unabated, and the Nazis' methods of extermination grew more efficient. More prisoners were being selected for death upon arrival. The use of gas chambers became routine, with entire groups of people being sent to their deaths in a matter of hours. The scale of this industrialized genocide was overwhelming, and each new report from Pilecki contained details of these horrors. But the world outside Auschwitz seemed slow to grasp the magnitude of the crimes being carried out within. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds and the crushing despair that surrounded him, Pilecki did not relent. His sense of duty to the people in the camp, to the resistance movement, and to the world outside kept him focused. His reports, which he managed to send through the underground network, provided crucial information about the inner workings of Auschwitz, the numbers of victims, the operational details of the gas chambers, and the overall methodical extermination taking place. But as time passed, it became increasingly clear to Pilecki that intelligence alone was not enough. The outside world, even when armed with the knowledge of the atrocities, was struggling to intervene. The war front was demanding the Allies' attention, and the slow pace of international recognition only deepened the frustration inside the camp. The resistance inside Auschwitz knew that if anything was to change, it would require more than just covert operations. While intelligence gathering remained critical, the ultimate goal was to disrupt the Nazis' plans, to bring the atrocities to a halt. The ZWZ began to prepare for larger acts of resistance. Prisoners within the camp, motivated by the belief that they had little left to lose, were starting to consider more radical options. In secret meetings, often held at great risk to their lives, Pilecki and his comrades began discussing the possibility of an uprising. If the prisoners could strike at the heart of the Nazis' operations, they might be able to create enough chaos to disrupt the mass killings, at least temporarily, and give the outside world the opportunity to act. But the obstacles to such a plan were immense. The Nazis controlled every aspect of life within the camp, and their surveillance of the prisoners was constant. Any sign of disobedience, any hint of rebellion, was met with swift and brutal punishment. To even think of organizing a large-scale uprising within the camp was dangerous beyond measure. Yet, the resistance felt that it was a risk worth taking. Pilecki knew that any attempt at rebellion would almost certainly lead to a massacre, but the need for action was pressing. Auschwitz had become the symbol of Nazi genocide, and the resistance movement, despite the odds, needed to act in the hope that the world would finally recognize the truth and intervene before it was too late. As 1943 progressed, the reality of the situation inside Auschwitz was becoming increasingly dire. The camp was bursting with prisoners, and the Nazis were expanding their efforts to annihilate entire populations. The death toll was staggering, and for those inside the camp, the specter of death loomed over everything. Yet, even in the face of this horror, the resistance did not falter. They continued to smuggle information out of the camp, hoping that one day their efforts would be recognized and would lead to action. Each report that Pilecki managed to send out became more desperate as he described the growing scale of the mass murders, the horrific conditions inside the camp, and the utter depravity of the Nazi regime. For Pilecki, the prospect of an uprising was not just about retaliation. It was about bearing witness to the atrocities. He was determined that the world would know what had happened in Auschwitz, even if it meant risking everything. His personal sacrifices were immense. His family, his life before the war, had been left behind when he entered the camp. He had no certainty that he would ever see them again, and yet he persisted. The stories he would eventually tell, the documentation he gathered, would be crucial in understanding the scale of the Holocaust and the incredible strength it took to resist in such dire circumstances. But Pilecki was not fighting for personal glory or recognition. His sole focus remained the defeat of the Nazis and the survival of his fellow prisoners. By early 1943, the prisoners within Auschwitz had begun to feel the suffocating pressure of their surroundings. The Nazis' grip on the camp was tightening. Despite the growing resistance, the prospects for a successful uprising were slim. The number of prisoners was increasing, and the SS had tightened their security, making any form of organization even more difficult. The systematic extermination of Jews, Roma, and other target groups continued with chilling efficiency. Pilecki and the resistance had little time to waste, and each day spent waiting for an opportunity felt like a day closer to being discovered. His reports to the outside world continued, but the Allies seemed slow to act. The war was far from over, and the defeat of Nazi Germany was still not a certainty. In the midst of this uncertainty, Pilecki's leadership continued to be a beacon of hope for the prisoners in Auschwitz. He was, in many ways, the heart of the resistance. He inspired courage in those around him, even when it seemed there was no hope left. His unwavering resolve became the rallying point for the prisoners, who, despite the overwhelming odds against them, began to find strength in their unity. Pilecki's ability to maintain the moral high ground in such an appalling environment was remarkable. He was not just a resistance leader. He had become a symbol of human dignity in the face of dehumanization. But as the year progressed, the opportunities for a successful uprising grew slimmer. Pilecki's frustration deepened as he watched the Nazis carry out their mass exterminations with mechanical precision. The scale of the death toll was beyond comprehension. Prisoners who arrived in Auschwitz were either worked to death, subjected to horrific medical experiments, or sent to the gas chambers. The survivors were often left in a state of profound despair, and yet the resistance never stopped pushing forward, believing that, one way or another, their actions would matter. While the resistance within the camp was essential to maintaining hope, it was clear that the scale of the genocide required action on a far larger scale. Pilecki's efforts to gather intelligence and expose the atrocities were invaluable, but the world had to act. His reports, detailing the operation of the gas chambers, the selection process, and the crematoria, were meant to sound an alarm, yet the response was slow. By 1943, it seemed as though the Allies were finally beginning to understand the scope of the Holocaust, but the time for intervention was quickly running out. The Nazi regime's atrocities were escalating, and the lives of millions more were at risk. Despite these challenges, Pilecki remained undeterred. His belief in the power of resistance, in the importance of bearing witness, and in the possibility of exposing the truth never wavered. He had come to understand the profound significance of his mission. It was not just about survival. It was about defiance in the face of evil. Even as the Nazis escalated their efforts to eliminate entire populations, Pilecki continued to resist, gathering information, coordinating sabotage, and doing everything in his power to disrupt the Nazi regime from within. His strength, his resolve, and his unshakable commitment to the cause would ultimately leave a legacy that would inspire future generations. By the spring of 1943, the environment inside Auschwitz had become more oppressive than ever, both for the prisoners and for Witold Pilecki, whose role in the resistance network was becoming ever more critical. The methods of extermination had become increasingly systematic and efficient, and the camp had now fully shifted its focus from a center of forced labor to one of total destruction. The Nazis' operation at Auschwitz was no longer just about punishment and suffering. It was about mass murder on an industrial scale. The gas chambers, once used sporadically, were now in constant use, and the crematoria churned day and night, consuming the bodies of those sent to their deaths. For Pilecki, the growing realization of the true scale of Nazi genocide was devastating. Each day, he saw the horror of the camp unfold around him. The once small and hopeful efforts of the resistance network had now expanded, not just in numbers, but also in scope. The Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZWZ, the underground resistance movement inside Auschwitz, had grown to include more prisoners, some of whom had been in the camp for months, others who were newly arrived. Despite the heavy security and the ever-present threat of exposure, the resistance remained determined to continue their work. It was no longer just a matter of gathering intelligence. The very survival of the prisoners was now at stake. Yet, despite the growing fear and pressure, Pilecki's leadership remained firm. His sense of duty, both to those imprisoned with him and to the world outside, was unwavering. Pilecki's leadership was tested as the SS tightened their grip on the camp. The Nazis were making sure that every corner of Auschwitz was under constant surveillance. The prisoners who had been assigned to labor details were now under even more scrutiny, with any sign of rebellion immediately crushed. The consequences of resistance were horrific. Anyone suspected of being involved in the underground movement was executed, often publicly, as a brutal example to others. Yet even in the face of such terror, Pilecki and the resistance continued their work. The hope for a larger uprising never fully died. The prisoners still believed that if they could mobilize enough people and strike at the heart of the Nazis' operations, they might be able to disrupt the system and perhaps even turn the tide of the war. But the challenges of organizing such an uprising were immense. The camp was overcrowded, with hundreds of thousands of prisoners, many of whom were not physically capable of fighting back. The SS were more organized and better armed than the resistance, and their knowledge of the camp's inner workings made any large-scale rebellion seem almost impossible. Despite this, Pilecki and his comrades never gave up on the idea. They knew that even if the uprising didn't succeed, it might be enough to send a message to the world outside. They knew they had to expose the truth about Auschwitz, and they had to do it before it was too late. The increased security and Nazi vigilance, however, didn't just make rebellion difficult. It also made communication between the resistance and the outside world even more dangerous. The reports that Pilecki had been sending out for over 2 years had provided the Allies with invaluable intelligence about the operation of the camp, the methods of extermination, and the scale of the mass murders. But despite the growing evidence, the international response had been disappointingly slow. The Allied forces were preoccupied with their military campaigns, and the sheer scale of the atrocities being committed seemed too difficult to believe for many. Pilecki, who had hoped that his efforts would lead to intervention, began to feel the crushing weight of this inaction. The world was still largely unaware of what was happening at Auschwitz, and time was running out. But even as the international response seemed to stall, the resistance movement inside Auschwitz continued to gain momentum. The prisoners, many of whom had lost everything, family, friends, their homes, found new purpose in their unity. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting back, however small and clandestine their actions might have been. The sabotage efforts grew bolder. Weapons were smuggled into the camp, and even small acts of rebellion, deliberate slowdowns of labor, or the refusal to work became ways of resisting the Nazis. While these acts did not immediately disrupt the Nazi war machine, they provided vital hope to the prisoners. They showed that the Nazis were not in complete control, but there were still people willing to fight back, to take risks, and to defy the atrocities surrounding them. Despite these small victories, the growing sense of fear and urgency within the camp was palpable. Every day, prisoners arrived in larger numbers, and the selections became more frequent and more brutal. For many of the new arrivals, there was no hope of survival. The SS carried out the selections with ruthless efficiency, sending the old, the sick, and those unable to work directly to the gas chambers. The resistance, though determined, was faced with a grim reality. There was little time to save those who were doomed upon arrival. Pilecki and his network had been able to smuggle some prisoners out, helping them escape the hellish grip of Auschwitz. However, the reality was that for most, survival was increasingly unlikely. Pilecki knew that the time for an uprising might be drawing near. The pressure was building on the resistance, as well as on the prisoners who were increasingly feeling the weight of the horror surrounding them. Yet, despite the fear and despair, the prisoners inside Auschwitz held on to their hope. They believed that if they could only survive long enough, the world would take notice of the reports coming from within the camp. They knew that the Allies could not ignore the evidence forever. But as the weeks turned into months, that hope began to feel more like a fragile thread. Pilecki's role was not just that of a leader, but of a symbol. His ability to continue organizing, to inspire those around him, gave the prisoners a sense of purpose. The conditions in Auschwitz had become unbearable, and many had lost their will to fight back. But Pilecki's leadership was an anchor in the storm. He maintained a calm and steady presence in the face of the madness, reminding the prisoners that their fight was not just for their own survival, but for the dignity of all those who had been lost to the Nazi terror. His unwavering commitment to exposing the truth kept the flames of resistance alive. As the year moved forward and the death toll at Auschwitz climbed ever higher, Pilecki began to reflect on the futility of his situation. The Allies still had not intervened in any meaningful way, and his resistance movement, though brave and determined, had not been able to halt the systematic destruction of lives. Yet, despite the growing sense of despair, Pilecki continued to fight on. His reports, which he had been smuggling out since his arrival, painted a picture of unimaginable horror. He had exposed the methods of extermination, the numbers of the dead, and the terror that permeated the camp. And while his work had gone largely ignored by the international community, he remained steadfast in his belief that history would one day recognize the truth. Pilecki understood that his survival in Auschwitz was not just about enduring physical hardship. It was about maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming despair. It was about standing against the evil that surrounded him and continuing the fight, no matter the odds. His belief in the possibility of a better world, even as the Nazis' genocidal machine continued to run unabated, never wavered. By the end of 1943, the situation inside Auschwitz had reached a fever pitch. The SS were tightening their grip, and the prospect of escape or successful resistance seemed increasingly remote. But Pilecki and his comrades refused to give in. They continued to sabotage, to resist, and to gather intelligence, all the while knowing that time was running out. For Pilecki, this was a moment of great personal reflection. He had spent years inside Auschwitz, fighting for the survival of the resistance, gathering intelligence, and attempting to expose the truth about what was happening within its walls. He had made tremendous sacrifices, and yet the end still seemed far off. But no matter how impossible the odds seemed, Pilecki refused to abandon the fight. By the beginning of 1944, Auschwitz had reached a point of no return. The brutal efficiency of the Nazi machinery was evident in every corner of the camp, where the systematic killing of millions of people was operating at full capacity. The scale of the atrocities had grown to such an extent that the sheer volume of human lives lost seemed incomprehensible. Prisoners continued to arrive in large numbers, and the methods of extermination became even more ruthless. The Nazis, determined to maintain control of the camp, implemented ever tighter security measures, making life inside Auschwitz even more treacherous for those who resisted. For Witold Pilecki, the situation was dire. Yet, as the SS tightened their grip, his commitment to his mission remained unwavering. Pilecki had been in Auschwitz for almost 3 years by now. His role as the leader of the resistance movement, the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZWZ, had grown even more crucial as the camp's role in a Nazi extermination project became more defined. Despite the ever-present threat of exposure, Pilecki continued to orchestrate the resistance within the camp, working tirelessly to maintain morale among the prisoners and to organize any possible act of sabotage. The resistance had become more entrenched, with members working in various sections of the camp, often passing information through secret channels and making use of any opportunity to disrupt the Nazis' operations. But this resistance came with its own set of dangers. The SS were becoming more vigilant, and any misstep could lead to immediate execution or the massacre of entire groups of prisoners. The atrocities inside Auschwitz were not just the result of the brutal actions of the SS guards. They were the culmination of a calculated, industrialized approach to genocide. The gas chambers, once used sporadically, were now running constantly, and the numbers of victims being sent to their deaths were staggering. The Zyklon B, the lethal pesticide used in the gas chambers, had become the weapon of choice, silently wiping out entire populations. The systematic killing had become so efficient that even the scale of the murders began to lose its impact on the SS. It was simply another part of their daily operations. The crematoria worked day and night, incinerating the bodies of those who had been murdered. The prisoners, those who had not yet been selected for death, were put to work in grueling conditions, often pushed to the brink of exhaustion and beyond. Yet for Pilecki, the fight for survival was not just about the physical toll. It was about maintaining the resistance, organizing, and providing hope to those who had been left with none. The death toll was accelerating, and the atmosphere of despair inside the camp grew ever thicker. Yet Pilecki continued to work on smuggling out intelligence about the camp's operations. His reports were becoming more detailed as the scope of the extermination efforts expanded. He sent word about the expanding number of gas chambers, the increasing efficiency of the Nazi killing operations, and the plans for further genocide against other populations, including the Romani and the Soviet prisoners. Each report that he managed to get out of the camp was a testament to his resilience, but it was also a desperate cry for help, hoping that someone, somewhere, would finally take action before it was too late. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, the international community seemed slow to act. The Allies were focused on the war effort, and the full scale of the Holocaust remained, for many, beyond belief. Pilecki's frustration was mounting. He had been trying for years to make the world aware of the atrocities happening inside Auschwitz, but the silence was deafening. He had been passing along critical information, risking his life to expose the truth, but the response from the outside world had been underwhelming. The war was pressing on, and while the Allies were beginning to make significant advances against the Nazis, the specific issue of Auschwitz seemed to be relegated to the background. It seemed that no matter how much intelligence Pilecki gathered, no matter how dire his reports were, nothing was changing. The death toll at Auschwitz continued to rise, and each day the Nazis grew bolder in their efforts to wipe out entire populations.